Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our event on animal welfare in the EU-Australia trade negotiations and the EU's role in commercial kangaroo hunting. The webinar is organized by Eurogroup for Animals with the support of the Intergroup of Animal Welfare and Eurogroup for Animals. Thank you very much for this. This event will have two sessions. The first session will provide an overview of what is at stake for animals in the EU-Australia negotiations and of animal welfare concerns linked to EU imports from Australia. It will also discuss the policy tool that could be used to ensure the agreement leads to real progress for animals. The second session will be hosted by my colleague Anja Hasekamp and will tackle the animal welfare, conservation, food safety and hygiene concerns over kangaroo hunting. Before we start, let me share some quick housekeeping rules. This meeting is streamed live on Facebook. There is no interpretation. All those who wish to intervene are invited to speak in English. Please keep yourself muted during the meeting. Please add your questions using the question and answer function, and they will be addressed at the end of the session. The webinar will be recorded. The video recording and presentations will be sent to all participants after the meeting. Now, let's kick off our first session. Dear all, let me start by thanking again Eurogroup for Animals and the Animal Welfare Intergroup for organizing this timely event. Yes, the timing here is important. While the EU-Australia trade negotiations are still open, we hope that the future free trade agreement will take into account EU's higher animal welfare standards and public concerns. Of course, the FTA with Australia should also reflect the EU's brand new political priorities under the European Green Deal, which includes important elements on biodiversity and agriculture called Farm to Fork strategy. There's a threefold historical momentum for a substantial change. First, the Paris Agreement has set a global common sense of the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Second, the pandemic COVID-19 has had a major impact on global trade and could set the ground for systemic change. And third, the WTO is in its biggest crisis, which is a good basis for new rules, echoing urgent needs of climate and animal protection. As a member of the Committee on International Trade, I am extremely eager to understand to what extent we could integrate some fundamental elements to be discussed today into the ongoing negotiations. You will find in me a fighter for animal welfare, and therefore the outcome of the two sessions today are relevant for my work here in the European Parliament. Back to the European Green Deal, which theoretically implies a real compatibility between all EU policies, including trade policy and its impact on animal welfare. We should clarify here, our approach does not only tackle animal welfare, it's also meant to make our society more resilient. Liberalization and trade has mostly fostered the intensification of animal production, which has been not only detrimental to animal welfare, but also intensified the spread of zoonosis and the rise in antimicrobial resistance. Biodiversity is another key issue, and the impact of trade agreements on losses of biodiversity must be better assessed, leading to stronger provisions. In the case of the trade talks between Australia and the EU, the sustainability impact assessment concluded that the deal would lead to increasing pressure on biodiversity and on negative impact on climate. The main reason mentioned is the ruminant meat sector.
Manuela, 1 second. I think you're muted. Just the last 30 seconds. Just the last 30 seconds.
I'm very sorry that I suddenly was muted. So I was talking about biodiversity. That is another key issue and the impact of trade agreements on losses of biodiversity. This must be better assessed. We had the sustainable impact assessment that concluded that the deal would lead to increased pressure on biodiversity and on the negative impact on climate. The main reason mentioned is the ruminant meat sector, sheep and cattle. And this is absolutely not acceptable, especially considering the recent wildfires that occurred in Australia and added pressure on many species. The impact assessment also suggested to better consider the impact that the conditions established in tariff rate quotas can have on animal welfare. The European Commission needs to take these findings into account, and the Intercommittee will be the place where this is needed to be assessed. So, what is at stake for animals in the negotiations that brought us here today? To begin with, I find it unbelievable that the EU still imports and exports live animals. At this stage, no one ignores the extreme suffering and pain inflicted to them, millions of them every year. This needs to stop. And what to say about the wording of the current text of the draft agreement? The truth is, nothing in the draft is likely to force Australia to change the way it usually treats its farmed animals. Did the European negotiators, namely the Commission's DG Trade, analyze the situation on the ground? Do they know all the facts? Do they care that in Australia around 500 million animals are raised on intensive family facilities where, according to several NGOs and official investigations, many shocking, outdated husbandry practices are allowed, mostly without pain relief? The experience of existing provisions on animal welfare cooperation included in almost all FTAs, apart from the Chilean case, reveals that once the agreements were in place, there was a lack of political willingness and resources to generate concrete progress for animals. Concretely, the EU has to seriously discuss with Australia how to improve the living conditions of animals like laying hens and broilers, or the handling, transport and slaughter of bovines and sheep. Before I give the floor to our speakers, allow me to say a few words about kangaroos. Every year, on average, 1.6 million of them are killed for commercial purposes in Australia, making it one of the biggest commercial hunts in the world. Many suffer horrific injuries rather than immediate death. The EU is the main importer of kangaroo meat and one of the main importers of their skin. We Europeans therefore have a significant responsibility for the treatment of kangaroo. Dear friends, let me conclude. Trade policy, currently under historic review, is at a crossroad. Up to now, excessive trade based on FTAs had a negative impact on animal and on the planet. This needs to change. The EU-Australia negotiations are the perfect opportunity for this. Now, let me introduce you to our first speaker, Stephanie Ghislain, who is the Trade and Animal Welfare Program Leader at Eurogroup for Animals. She will introduce the key asks of Eurogroup for Animal in the context of these negotiations. Stephanie, please.
Many thanks, Manuela, for this very, very good introduction. Let me share my PowerPoint very quickly. Here we are. You said it all almost. As you know, most of you know, probably Eurogroup for Animal is the Pan-European Association of Animal Protection NGOs. We have currently 70 member organizations in 24 EU member states, but actually also beyond, we have members, as you will see, in Australia too. And my work is specifically funded by the 6 NGOs you can see there, and it's always a good opportunity to thank them, because thanks to them, I can only work on trade policy. So I wanted to basically tell you a bit more about why we do work on trade policy, why we think it matters, and a bit of our asks in the context of Australia-EU negotiations. Not too long, because speakers will say much more interesting things. So basically, to start with, we look into trade because most of trade negotiations cover animal products, because they have to cover substantially all trade. And also, those negotiations looked at tariffs, and tariffs are usually still quite high on animal products. But now more and more, they look at what we call non-tariff barriers. So this means all the standards, the rules. The idea is basically to aim at having less differences in order to facilitate trade. And the third point is also that generally, relatively speaking, the EU is seen as a leader on animal welfare topics, and most of EU standards do not apply to imported products. We believe this situation leads to a few risks and also to opportunities. Basically, the key issue is that often when you further open the market, you have an increase in imported products. And most of those products compared to the EU are produced under lower animal welfare standards in many cases. And so basically we have had over the past 10 years what we call a chilling effect. It's been 10 years without any new rule on farm animal welfare. We hope Farm to Fork is going to change this, of course, but this is also linked to the pressure the EU producers are feeling, and they feel there's a lack of level playing field, there is some unfairness. When they want to more and more export, they do not need to respect such standards, so they feel there is an unnecessary burden on them, and they are usually advocating not to have even more rules, although many are needed in many areas, even in the EU. And the second issue that was already mentioned a bit by Manuela is that usually when you open further the market, you have an increase in production in many cases. The idea in trade is to foster trade flows, but also to produce growth. And so technically to have an impact on the output, on the production. So in some cases, it leads to an increase in production in the EU or in the partner countries. And in many cases, this does not benefit the small farms. This benefits bigger companies with a more intensified process. And we have noticed over the past 10 years, it leads to more and more intensification in the animal sector. And not only us, also several sustainability impact assessment produced commissioned by the EU have underlined this. Of course, there are also opportunities that we work on. For instance, the EU is the only partner at the moment to almost always include a provision on animal welfare cooperation in its trade agreements. And this is an opportunity to cooperate and even to provide technical assistance to partners, even though you have no other platform to do so. So this is a good thing. And the other point is that the EU in negotiation has some trade leverage like other countries might have on some other products. And so technically, sometimes the EU can use this leverage in order to raise certain issues that are maybe less connected to the trade agreement itself, but also to maybe impose what we call conditional liberalization, which is the fact that you only give a better tariff if higher standards are adopted, like the EU has now offered normally in the draft EU-Mercosur agreement. So basically only producers of shell eggs, in this case, that respect EU rules on laying hens will be able to benefit from the better tariff. So this is a key idea. And this is something EU citizens are actually promoting and in support of. You can see 93% would like to see all our animal welfare standards apply to imported products, not only slaughter rules. And almost 90% wants to see the EU do more to promote animal welfare globally. And this is from 2016. Other figures show it's increasing. And so one of the best tools the EU has, as the EU has itself found out in a study it commissioned, DG Santé, the best tool they had is actually the slaughter regulation that applies to imported products, because it gives an incentive to foreign producers to increase standards, because if they do, they access the EU market. And this is an approach we would like to see in the context of the EU-Australia negotiation, to look into how we can include animal welfare-related conditions in tariff rate quotas, in liberalization, either linked to on-farm practices or to transport-related standards. We would also like to see a very an unprecedented cooperation chapter or provisions with the aim of having regulatory alignment, and the scope of it could go beyond farm animals, also looking at animals used in science, at wild animals. Of course, we hope that the EU can raise the issues of mulesing, which we will discuss later, and the issue of kangaroos, although the tariffs on those products are zero at the moment, but we'll go in further details with the next presenters. And as you might know, in trade agreement, there is a trade and sustainable development chapter often. And what we would want to see there is first provisions on sustainable agriculture, which has never been done at the moment, and sustainable aquaculture that exists already. And in those provisions, a link with fish animal welfare in general. We would like to see stronger wildlife trade and conservation provisions, allowing to protect further than what can be done with CITES. At the moment, we need to do more, and we need to find ways to cooperate together to go further. And we want to see stronger enforcement mechanism, like some other countries are doing, like New Zealand or Canada. Would like to see a better way to do something when commitments are not respected. And I will finish on that because the introduction was very good from Manuela. You're still muted, Manuela.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I'm sorry for this unmuting thing that does not always work. Now let's move on to our second speaker. It's Mrs. Glenys Ochis, who is one of the most experienced animal advocates in Australia. Mrs. Orchis has a degree in behavioral science and has contributed to numerous national reviews of codes of practice and animal welfare laws in each state and territory in Australia. Mrs. Orchis, you are currently the CEO of Animal Australia. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Manuela, and thank you, Stephanie, as well. I'm really pleased to address the meeting today, and pleased that your group, of course, have facilitated this. We do look to Europe for leadership, and we do believe that there's some leverage that could be extended in this free trade agreement series, and we really do hope that that will occur. I'm speaking quite narrowly today, but primarily about the animal protection regime in Australia, and to indicate that we currently have many low standards of animal welfare. The Australian Constitution puts the responsibility for animal welfare with the states and territories, and there are 6 states, 2 territories, and so most issues come under those states, and so they're varied laws and codes that we have. The exception to that is where it relates to exported animals or products, and so live export and kangaroo products, of course, and I won't speak about those today because others will. But the welfare standards in Australia are diverse, and that is because of the very large country we are, and the difference in the standards or difference in the realities for industries across Australia. What that's meant is that codes of practice and then standards and guidelines and laws that come out of those have actually just reflected those systems. And so we have systems that are really steeped, if you like, in the early settling of this country, and they have not moved with the times. I will provide some examples today of the myriad of voluntary codes, regulatory standards, and the problems that they allow, that is the animal welfare issues that are allowed through them. The first is to say is that there are some common elements in Australian codes, standards, regulations and laws, and they are that all of the standards are low, in most cases below EU standards. And currently they do not reflect scientific knowledge, which has grown, as you know, over the last several decades. They do not reflect current community standards, and not unlike the slide that Stephanie just showed, Australians do care about animal welfare, but the standards haven't kept up with that concern. The codes, some of the reason for that is the codes and standards review processes for farmed animals is really slow, it's cumbersome, and it is dominated by animal industries. For example, all the new standards must ultimately be signed off by all of the states, each of the states and territories and federal agriculture ministers. So 9 agricultural ministers with the clear, not just perceived, but clear conflict, if you like, between those that they are wanting to serve, that is the agricultural industries who don't want change, and what that means is, of course, that the agriculture ministers, when they come to the decision, usually waver on that side and don't allow significant progress. What we do have, because there's so many people involved in it, that is so many states and territories and so many other stakeholders, we end up with the lowest common denominator. That is, the lowest standards of any states will prevail. And I'm talking here about animal husbandry, about transport and housing standards, which are permitted in the codes. And when I want to explain too, that when the codes have been developed over the last decades, what they've done is, as I say, they've really documented current standards, not improvement in standards. And once that is in place, most of the state legislations then exempt anything, allow anything that's documented in a code. So in other words, there's this double standard, one for those things that are allowed in codes of practice, which are usually standard practices, and then another, which is for other animals that come under Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act or Animal Welfare Acts. Some examples of what I'm talking about with low standards was already mentioned, battery caging for egg-laying hens. I realise there's not a trade in eggs out of Australia, but this is just to demonstrate how far we are behind, if you like, particularly the EU. The first codes that were put into place were in 1983 for poultry and including egg-laying hens. They've effectively exempted the barren battery cage from state cruelty laws. That continues to this day. The current code, 2001 code, I was involved in that review, knocked back, did not allow any phase out, did not even envisage a phase out, even though that was when it was being put together. It was the exact time when the EU Parliament was voting to phase out battery cages. We're now in the middle of a review of that poultry standard, some 20 years later. And again, the egg industry here in Australia is raining against any change, even a phase out. I want to talk to you about land transport. We're a very, very large country. For example, France would fit into Western Australia, it's one of our states, although the largest, 5 times. It's a very big country, and cattle and sheep particularly, obviously other animals, but cattle and sheep particularly in very large numbers, millions, will be transported very long distances, including across state lines. For example, just over the last 6 months, some 1 million sheep have been sent all the way from Western Australia to the eastern states, 2,000 to 3,000 kilometres. And we do not have food or water on our trucks. It's different to in Europe. So it's very difficult. The other problem, and this is permitted under the new land transport standards for both cattle and sheep, to be 48 hours without food and water between when they're last fed on the farm, for example, until the other end. But another complication of this is that those standards do not require that the last time they were fed and watered is recorded for most of those shipments, if they're expected not to be more than 24 hours. And so without that recording, they could go for 48 hours. Indeed, they could go to a sale yard or to an abattoir and still not be fed and watered and it wouldn't be clear whether or not they were transgressing the law. Having said that, even the adoption of these low standards takes so long after approval. For example, even though the land transport of livestock standards came in on 2009, Western Australia just this year, so 11 years later, is the last state to actually adopt them. So things are very difficult here in Australia when it comes to transport such large distances, often hot or very cold weather too, that they go through. The last set of examples I'll talk about is the failure of the cattle and sheep standards. They're 2 separate standards that were debated and reviewed between 2009 and 2016. Again, only 3 states have even, in this last 4 years since they were adopted, actually put them into their legislation at this stage. But putting that aside, the standards themselves are so low, again, because of this conflict, if you like, but also the railing of industries against anything that would make a standard mandatory. They do not want high standards to be mandatory, or even low standards. The cattle standards, for example, allow castration of males, dehorning of cattle, branding, anything up to 12 months of age, if that's the first time that they've been able to be mustered, for example, and even 6 months on closely settled farming land. There is no requirement for pain relief, even though trisulfan, a spray on pain relief, has been available for cattle for some years. An oral administration of greater pain relief, buckalgesic, has been available for about 2 years now. And yet, even though those things were coming in the market, when we debated these standards, the industry, the cattle industry, would not agree to them being mandatory. Some of them now believe and say that they should be voluntary, and they hope that their industries will uptake them, but that's not going to happen unless there is a reason to do so. That is a legal reason to do so. I'll finish the last example in regard to sheep. And again, under the current sheep standards, those adopted 4 years ago, they allow castration, they allow tail docking and tail cutting of sheep. They allow mulesing, which will be discussed shortly. They even allow laparoscopic insemination of ewes, that is a surgical procedure without any pain relief, even though topical analgesia, trisulfan, has been available, and now we also have an oral pain relief the last 4 years. These are just examples, but to indicate to you that many millions of animals, cattle and sheep we're talking about particularly at the moment, but also our other animals, particularly factory farmed animals in close confinement, that is all okay under our so-called standards, our national standards, which the states take up. And so we have a situation where very low standards are approved. There is not a good scientific analysis that goes into this, and certainly recent science has not been adopted when the reviews occur. And so our standards do not comply with current scientific knowledge. They do not accord with Australian community views. They simply are permitted by agriculture ministers who are conflicted. I really do call on the European Union to help us to move these standards forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glynis. We know a lot in the European Union about lowest common denominator, so that's nothing new for us. Let's come to our next speakers. It's Rebecca Picayo-Ril and Dr. Stephen Thornton. Rebecca is an international campaigner at the Global Animal Welfare Organization for PAWS. Stephen is a principal of BG Economics in Brisbane, Australia. As a socio-economist, Stephen applies his expertise and thinking to contemporary and emerging social issues, including animal welfare, to help shape social and public policy. Dear speakers, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Manuela, for the introduction. I'll quickly share my screen. Here we go. And hello to everyone. In this session, we will speak about that an end to mulesing is not only necessary, but it also is possible. And it will be me, Rebecca from PAWS, speaking about our work we have done together with colleagues from the Humane Society International and, as you mentioned before, Dr. Stephen Thornton from BG Economics. I will start by explaining what mulesing actually is, what it means for the lambs, why it was invented 100 years ago, and why an end to mulesing is inevitable and feasible. And then Dr. Thornton will then go on and highlight the main findings of a groundbreaking economic report published this year, and proving that pain-free alternatives to this mutilation, they are available, they're tested, and they're even economically beneficial for wool growers. So let's start with mulesing. It is essentially a mutilation. Usually 2 to 10-week-old lambs are restrained on their backs in a metal cradle, as you can see on the picture to the left, while large stripes of skin around the breech and tail stumps are cut away by sharp shears at full conscious, causing extreme pain, leaving behind a wound that takes weeks to heal. And for some lambs, this procedure can be fatal. So why is it done? What is the purpose of mulesing? Mulesing was invented in the 1920s in response to regular outbreaks of fly strike. And fly strike happens when blowfly lay eggs in the wrinkles of a sheep, because in these wrinkles, moisture, and especially around the hindquarters, feces and urine, they are retained. And that is what flies are largely attracted to. So after hatching, maggots can infest the sheep, and when untreated and undetected, it can lead to extreme pain and even death. So there is no doubt that this is a great animal welfare risk. And mulesing was invented 100 years ago with good intentions, lacking other options we luckily have today. Before I highlight those, I want to further explain what this really means for the animals. So mulesing is actually the biggest surgical intervention which farmed animals are routinely subject to. The pain caused by mulesing is acute, it lasts up to 3 days, and the impact of mulesing, they are so intense that lambs can go into a state of shock. Researchers have further documented the extreme pain and stress measured through elevated cortisol levels. Furthermore, abnormal behaviors were detected, sudden bolting and an unusual stiff walk. In addition, lambs will actively avoid the person who mules them for up to 5 weeks. And in the end, the sheep are not really fully protected from flies because mulesing is not a full body protection. The flies can still lay eggs in wrinkles on other body parts of the sheep, which is called body strike. So mulesing, or even freeze mulesing, which is a new alternative breech modification where they use, instead of shears, liquid nitrogen, there are no solution, no sustainable solution. Let's please summarize here. What makes mulesing a real problem is the combination of blowflies, the humid Australian climate, and sheep with too many wrinkles. As you can see on the picture to the bottom left, this is a sheep as a result of decades of overbreeding with a lot of wrinkles, with the idea behind to get more wool out of it and make more profit. But it also created an animal which is highly susceptible to parasites, such as blowflies, resulting in fly strike. And fly strike actually costing Australia $170 million each year. So we support the pain-free solution. You can see a picture to the right. These sheep genetics with less or no wrinkles, called plain or smooth-bodied sheep. They are naturally more resistant towards parasites and even extreme weathers, making mulesing obsolete. And this is a sustainable solution tackling both fly strike and mulesing. And it's also demanded by the market. When asking consumers, they don't want mulesed wool and they're ready to pay more for non-mulesed wool. And if we heard before from Stephanie, citizens, they're concerned about the animal welfare. And the majority of EU citizens, they want to see imported animal products respect EU equivalent standards. And this awareness is just rising due to high media interest. And this is also why brands, they don't want mulesed wool. And more international brands, they're positioning themselves against mulesing publicly. And some of them, they're setting time-bound commitments until when they no longer source for mulesed wool, like Abercrombie & Fitch, H&M, Hugo Boss, just to name a few. That means the global demand for non-mulesed is there, it is growing, and with such commitments, it will continue to grow. Mulesing and animal welfare in total is highly on the agenda of governments as well. In implementing the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example, governments and brands, they consider animal welfare as one of the biggest risks. And as a result, I've mentioned before, brands have committed to phase out mulesed wool, and how they do it via full supply chain traceability standards. Even brands like the North Face or H&M, they have supported the creation of such industry standards, like the responsible down or wool standard. And mulesing is also a topic within the free trade negotiations between Australia and the EU. This is why we're here today. So that leaves me with one question. When we know there are pain-free alternatives which are demanded, there are standards in place to verify this non-mule status, why is mulesing still practiced? There could be various potential reasons. Some of them they might not know, wool growers might not know that there are pain-free alternatives and what they can do. And lack of knowledge leads to lack of trust. They might not know there are even premiums for non-mulesed wool. And that leaves them with the imagination, with the perception that mulesing is the only or the best option. We've heard many times that mulesing became some sort of a tradition even in Australia, and traditions many times are left unquestioned. Another reason could be also the lack of political and industry leadership to help wool growers to transition away. Australia actually committed to end of mulesing by 2010. 10 years later, it is still the only country worldwide practicing mulesing, and it is also the biggest wool producing country worldwide. That means a lot of animals are affected. More than 10 million lambs are mulesed each year in Australia. And while New Zealand has legally banned mulesing in 2018, and individual wool growers in Australia are transitioning away using pain-free alternatives, there are still industry bodies in Australia who focus on tackling fly strike. When a recent report published this year in May, commissioned by Meat and Livestock Australia, concluded that the elimination of fly strike is possible, but it has to go hand in hand with ending mulesing. How? By switching to less susceptible sheep. As I mentioned before, less and no wrinkles, this plain and smooth-bodied sheep. This is a pain-free and sustainable way forward, which we support. And we had so many positive stories from wool growers who transitioned away by doing that. And we wanted to quantify that, what we have been told, and also addressing the biggest and common fears we've heard so many times. Fears around the duration of the transition, the cost, the effectiveness. Some said they are scared to use more chemicals to really protect the sheep, or that there are negative impacts on the wool amount or quality. And we were so pleased to find out through this report and the wool growers we asked that these are misconceptions. And we really hope that this new report towards a non-mulesed future will give other wool growers the confidence to follow this path. And we urge wool industry leaders as well as political leaders to support growers who are keen to find out more about this genetic solution. I'll now pass you across to Dr. Stephen Thornton from Beach Economics, who wrote this amazing report, to tell you more about it. Thank you for listening.
Is Stephen there?
Yes, I am here. Thank you very much. Just looking to share my screen. Okay, you should be able to see my screen now. Okay. All right, well, today I'm going to give a brief presentation of a study that we conducted in December 2019 and January 2020, which was a 6-week survey of nearly 100 wool growers in Australia who have transitioned from wrinkly breed type sheep to plain bodied sheep. As the study was undertaken in the context of animal welfare being increasingly important to consumers, and of course it is now a very big factor in the purchasing decisions of products and services. So what you'll see now is that industries and businesses, or even countries that do not recognise this or are really slow to recognise it, really risk consumers making alternative purchasing decisions where there is a substitute product. And of course, wool competes with cotton and synthetic fibres. Rebecca has gone through the history of mulesing in Australia, developed by a man called John Mules, which is where the term mulesing comes from. And as Rebecca has said, millions of lambs in Australia are mulesed each year, estimated at 77% of ewe lambs and 66% of merino weather lambs. The survey collected a range of data on the experiences of those nearly 100 producers, or wool growers, or growers as we call them, from different parts of the country. And that's very important because, as you will be aware, Australia is a very large country, I should say, and it has very dry areas as well as wetter areas. And what we sought to do was to try and find out from these growers, from an operational, financial and animal welfare perspective, you know, why and how they made the transition to plain-bodied merinos and what the associated benefits and costs were. We found that nearly all wool growers have experienced increased financial benefits, and the welfare of their animals is also improved. So again, picking up on what Rebecca said earlier when she showed a few photographs of a wrinkly breed type sheep and a plainer bodied sheep. This is one of the images that, or pictures that we had in our survey. It's a standard visual score method of rating body wrinkle. So you will see there's a from score 1 to score 5. In Australia, typically the body wrinkle of sheep, because they've been bred for decades and decades and decades, they're typically more for score 4 and score 5 sheep. The growers in this study have transitioned away from that higher, more susceptible end to score 1, 2, and a few score 3. So you'll see just above that just under 2/3 of respondents in our survey have score 1 sheep, 27.4% of score 2 sheep, and just under 1 in 10 have score 3 sheep. Again, there's another image of quite plain-bodied sheep. You'll see one sheep there that seems to have a little bit more wrinkling, but still fairly plain-bodied. So just on to the key findings, and again, just be aware that we asked nearly 50 questions. So I've just really picked out 8 or 9 of the sort of key findings. So 77.5% completed the transition to plain-bodied merinos within 5 years, and just over 4 in 10 within 2 years. That's an important finding because there is a lot of talk in the industry about it taking a very long time to transition. That's not what we found in this study. 83.5% said transition to plain-bodied merinos is not costly. Again, some of the things you hear is that it's costly to do. That's not what we found. 82% have experienced increased lamb growth rates, and lambing percentage is also increased, and very low breech strike, which is, as Rebecca, I think, said, which is around the rear end of the sheep. It's called the breech area, and less than or equal to 0.5% of body strike. Just moving on, again, nearly 9 in 10 growers say that they receive a price premium for their unmulsed wool. 84% have experienced an increased return on investment. And if you see on the graph just down the bottom here, there was another nearly 15% said no change, and only one grower said that they actually experienced a slight decrease. So that was a very interesting result. 86% say they would recommend to other growers to undertake the transition to plain-bodied merinos, and nearly all growers say that not mulesing is important for their farm's future profitability. A couple of other points here. In terms of the wool cut per ewe, we asked growers about how much wool they cut from their ewes in a normal non-drought season, and we actually compared that to a national survey of a very large sample some thousands of growers in 2017, and you'll see on that chart there that the amount of wool cut compares quite favourably to that 2017 survey. So what that says is that these growers are getting as much wool cut off their ewes as what generally you would find being cut off all sheep in Australia. Just talking about the actual fineness of wool of these wool growers. Wool fibres are measured in microns, which is 1,000 of a millimetre. The majority of growers in this survey produce fine to superfine wool in the 18 to 19.9 micron range, with almost 1/3 producing even finer wool. In terms of some of the wool characteristics, in terms of the colour and other areas, this again was quite a good result, where growers reported getting quite significant improvement in colour, fleece rot character and staple, and pretty good results in scouring and staining. In terms of the time that we have here, I won't go through what all those are, but certainly good results there. In terms of these things called jetting and wigging and crutching and drenching, again, I've actually put down the bottom of the slide a short definition of those things. Probably the main one in regards to chemicals externally applied to sheep, which is jetting. We had nearly 70% of growers say that they never or almost never jet, and 23.9% only do so once a year. We also asked a few qualitative questions. We had an open box where growers could give their answers to a couple of questions about how they perceive the current state of play. I won't read those out, but generally they are concerned that the industry hasn't moved forward as much as they would have hoped, and they're concerned about Australia getting a bad reputation. We also conducted 7 case studies, and the pictures on this slide and the next slide of the people and the sheep in these are the 7 case study participants. And again, they were from different states in Australia in different climate zones. So what they said, they gave us 4 main recommendations for other growers who would be interested in finding out more about how to transition and how to do it successfully. The first one is the mind shift to make it happen is the #1 hurdle. Talk to other wool growers who have already made the transition, as they have the practical knowledge. Secondly, growers must be really committed to the transition process. You really must have the patience to see the transition through. Thirdly, education is key. Attend some information sessions, seminars. Good understanding of basic wool biology is essential to avoid a relapse to wrinkly sheep. That is going back to where you were. The 4th recommendation was to buy rams from a stud that has stopped mulesing, and to find a stud that aligns with breeding direction and that carefully considers skin and wool qualities. So in summary, the Australian wool growers in this study who have made the transition to plain-bodied sheep, and nearly 9 in 10, nearly 90% have made that within the last 15 years. They're now well positioned to meet the market in the years to come as wool growers make the decision to stock only products which use non-mules wool. And I've got a little link there to the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca and Stephen. It is good that the international brands react on the will of the consumers and that they are against mute sheep, and that, amongst others, for farmers, the economic figures speak in favor of not mulesing. But let's turn to the Commission. Mr. Niels Weller is there, and I'm looking forward to hear his reaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The typical question, can you all hear me? Is it fine? Yes, you can. So thank you very much, Mrs. Rieper. Thank you very much to all previous speakers for the interesting reports and for your work, which is always an important source of information and also of reflection for us. I'm the FTA coordinator of DG Trade, the Trade Directorate General of the Commission. I will give you a very quick, extremely quick overview of where we are in the negotiations for the context. And then I hand over to my colleague, Nicolas Gut from the DG Santé, Director General for Sanitary Measures, who are also on the lead on animal welfare and who are actually conducting the negotiations in this particular area. So we have started the FTA negotiations in June 2018, so about 2 years ago, and have already conducted 8 rounds. The last one in September, and the next one will be in December. So we have a very high speed and in big intensity in the negotiation rounds. The negotiations are progressing well and quickly, but are obviously a very complex matter. So it always takes quite a while to get all different areas settled. We believe, or there's ambition on both sides to make 2021 to come to a crucial stage. Whether we are able to settle all, it has to be seen, but we will come to the most difficult areas certainly next year. All our negotiation texts are published on our internet site as usual, including the one on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which include the article on animal welfare, to which Mrs. Rieper already referred to at the beginning. Also, all round reports are published, and we have regular civil society events where we report back to the civil society. The next one covering Australia will be on the 10th of October, and I'm sure some of you will join us there. So that's all what I wanted to say for the context, and with that I hand over to Nicola, who can report more on where the state of the negotiations on animal welfare and sanitary and phytosanitary measures is. Thank you.
Nicolas, feel free to unmute. I will suggest you to do it. It might be more.
Okay, yes, hello, here's Nicolas Gut. I prefer without the video in order to have the connection run. So yes, state of play of animal welfare article in the agreement. As already said, animal welfare is always a #1 issue that we want to have in the negotiations of the SPS. So we have done that from the very beginning. And yes, it is, as in most of our FTAs, it's on cooperation. And we have a text which is currently now under internal consultation in Australia. As already explained, Australia is not just federally managed, so it needs to agree with the territories, and there is a certain delay which has happened. What they claim it is related to the bushfires and also the COVID situation, but they said and promised that now in autumn they would resume this and do these internal consultations and then come back to us. So that's what we are hoping now. We have therefore in the last months waited on this because we have roughly the text. And okay, so we are waiting and we hope that Australia will now soon come back. So the ball is on their side. And then as also already mentioned, also we try to get into this agreement all the new EU policies with the sustainability, farm to fork and so on, which are to a certain extent last minute issues, and they are not under the scope of the negotiations of the directives, but we still try to get it inside, but we'll have to see how far we will get this. But we consider that it's also an important element to have animal welfare embedded in these discussions, as already also said. So, but on this we cannot say yet anything, as we are not yet so advanced on these issues. So I think that's the state of the negotiations on the animal welfare part, what I would provide for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Niels, and thank you, Nicolas. Yeah, it's a pity that we couldn't hear more what in but especially as we were talking so much about mulesing, if you have this taken into account in a way, but maybe you can say it later on a little bit more. Now, to conclude the presentations of the session, and before we move to our discussion, let me give the floor to Mrs. Joanna Granger, Chancellor of the Australian Mission to the EU. Mrs. Granger, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Look, I'm pleased to be participating in today's session. And I first of all would like to start off by telling you about how the Australian government and the Australian community very much take the issue of animal welfare seriously. We do actually have high standards of animal welfare, and we've got a comprehensive legal framework and management approach across the Australian government and all states and territories. And that's for management of livestock, for native species and domestic pets. And as earlier speakers have talked about, the different responsibilities are set out in the Australian Constitution. But some key examples to point the panel to in terms of our high animal welfare standards is that in 2015, the World Organization for Animal Health, which of course is the independent international standard setting body, undertook a audit of Australia's animal welfare, and it showed that we have got level 5 competency, which is the highest level of animal welfare competency for veterinary services, and we're one of few nations in the world to receive this. And of where Australia is able to meet the EU standards. We have very similar animal welfare standards, and we think we're on a race to the top for animal welfare standards, is that since 2012, the EU has undertaken 5 in-country audits to evaluate Australia's controls over meat and dairy production. Each audit, which included an assessment of animal welfare outcomes, found very positive feedback for Australia. So in our trade with the EU, we are meeting the EU's high standards, and we're meeting them well. In terms of the FTA, I think I just want to give you a bit of understanding about the size and scale of Australian agriculture. So for instance, compared to the EU, we have a very small agriculture sector. We have about 85,000 farming businesses, and the majority of those, over 95%, are family-owned businesses. To give you a sense of scale, Australia's cattle herd is about 28 million head, whereas the EU has 78 million head. And just to be clear, our red meat industry is actually our largest agriculture sector by far. So we are a much smaller contributor to world agriculture. Obviously, our farm sizes are much larger, around 4,400 hectares, but that's because we have a very old continent, we have very old dry soils, we have low water. And so it's important to have very large cattle and sheep stations in order to be able to meet the carrying capacity of the land. And as a result, it means that we have very low intensity farming in our red meat sector. In terms of the kind of leadership opportunities our red meat sector is showing, the Australian industry in 2017 committed to a carbon neutral by 2030 goal. We're the first industry in the world to commit to that. Millions of dollars of research and development is going into the target. And right now we already have some carbon neutral stakes available in Australia. So that's a whole of supply chain businesses that are providing carbon neutral product. So there's a range of areas where we're very confident in our sustainability credentials. Australian farmers are open to innovation and practice change. They need to be competing on international markets. We service over 100 international markets with our agricultural produce. And so we have a lot of best practice sustainable farming to share, and we look forward to contributing to the goals of the Farm to Fork project. We're very confident that the FTA negotiations will allow us to share best practice, and we're looking forward to learning about best practice around the world. In terms of our animal welfare management framework, I think Australia recognises that animal health science is continuously being updated, and that we need to make sure that our legislative framework and our management practice are on a path of continuous improvement. So let me tell you about just some of the things that are happening in animal welfare in Australia right now. So right now, the animal welfare standards and guidelines for poultry, for pigs, for land transport and for slaughter are all under development or review. We have a national horse traceability register is being designed and discussed. Obviously, biosecurity management of pest and disease affecting animals is an incredibly important element in Australia. It's under constant review and assessment and control. And then, of course, we have Australia's 6 animal industries, rural research and development corporations. Now, they're investing millions of dollars every year on animal health and welfare science and extension so that farmers can understand improved practices and adopt them on farm. And then, of course, there is a national animal welfare research, development and extension strategy, and that looks at those cross-cutting issues that affect all farmed animal industries. We are committed to taking action where animal welfare incidents arise through investigation and prosecution where necessary. And where the system isn't working, we change it. So for instance, we now have in place some of the strictest and most comprehensive rules governing live animal exports in the world. And that's through our exporter supply chain assurance system. I want to briefly touch on mulesing. It's been an important debate today, very important issues raised. And obviously, part of the reason mulesing was conducted, as earlier speakers have said, is because fly strike is a terrible animal health issue for sheep, and it is something that happens in Australia due to our climatic conditions. But Australian Wool Innovation, which is our research and development corporation specifically focusing on the wool industry. So wool growers and Australian government through our levies have invested over $37 million since 2001 into alternatives to mulesing. And those things are looking at non-invasive management practices as well as genetic research and enhanced breeding for fly strike resistance. So exactly the kind of thing that that BG Economics has been looking at. There's a range of activity going on. And I think it's fair to say that fly strike is one of the most important issues for the Australian wool industry. It's well understood. In terms of industry leadership and support, Wool Producers Australia is our largest wool growing industry representative body. It's got about 18,000 wool growers as members. It strongly supports alternatives to mulesing, and it recommends that where you need to mulese, you always do pain relief. Now, as a result of the work that Australian Wool Innovation has done, and of course the practice change that we've been hearing about today on the call, around 83% of lambs mulesed in Australia are now mulesed with pain relief. And the industry is moving towards all lambs where if mulesing is the only option because of the production area that you're in, because of the fly strike risk, that pain relief is offered. There's obviously a lot of producers, as we're hearing, turning to other methods, selective breeding, chemical control, and then additional shearing and crutching throughout the year to really reduce that risk. Approximately 70% of Australia's wool clip is declared through our National Wool Declaration Scheme. And through this scheme, approximately 29 million kilograms of wool was declared as non-mules, that's just one category alone, in 2018-19. So Australia is a major and growing producer of non-mules wool, and the wool is backed by an industry certification scheme that provides confidence to the people buying wool in the market and to consumers. We've got a traceable system, and we've got an integrity program supporting that traceability system. I think I might leave it there for now. I'd be very happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Joanna. It's good to hear that you put a focus on animal welfare because it's still a long way to go. We heard the presentation of Glenys, and especially on land transport and in other sectors, there's still a lot to do. So it's very good that you want to revise your animal welfare laws. I'm happy to hear that. And not to forget, you said that the agriculture sector is a small one, but you still have 500 million animals raised in intensive animal farming. So this is really a huge number. And yeah, I already talked about the consequences. So I'm happy to hear that you're on your way to do more animal welfare standards rules and to come to maybe our standards can be more closer than they are at the moment. Now, Stephanie, time is flying. Do we still have time for 2 or 3 questions, or is it already?
I would suggest, Manuela, if that's all right with you, to maybe just address a short question that was really related to sheep that I have in the Q&A, and to leave maybe the wider questions on what they can be done in the trade agreement for after the kangaroo discussions. As the speakers are the same as the Commission is staying and the Australian mission as well, if you don't mind. There was one question for Ms. Granger, which is about the reason for not providing pain relief to the 15 or so lambs. So the issue that Glenys mentioned of the lack of making mandatory the use of pain relief in many production systems when certain mutilations are carried on. So maybe we can just tackle that one, which is very specific. And if you don't mind, you can conclude, Manuela, and then pass on the floor for the next session.
Yes, please, Mrs. Joanna, if you would like to answer.
Thank you. Well, as I said, there is a significant change in production, particularly in the last decade from the Australian wool growers. A very large percentage of mulesing is being conducted under pain relief, and the strong recommendation from the industry leadership body in terms of our largest one, Wool Producers Australia, is to recommend that mandatory pain relief happen. One of our states and territories is already moving in that way. The Victorian state government has required mandatory pain relief, and I expect others will do so as well. So I think it's definitely a very swift change within industry. There's a very strong commitment to improving. Of course, remembering that farmers really do value the health and welfare of their animals. Their animals are part of a successful business operation. A healthy and healthy animal helps for a profitable and sustainable business operation.
Okay. Thank you very much. Maybe later on we can resume some questions because there are a lot, especially animal welfare. But now I don't want to lose more time. Thank you very much for this first session. We learned a lot. We see that there's still a lot to do, and that the EU and Australia trade negotiations need absolutely more animal welfare provisions. And Mr. or Nicolas, yeah, I hope really very much that further on you can give us more insights and that you take this really very serious, because as I said in my beginning speech, it's not about only the suffering of animals, but it's to see the whole picture about zoonoses, pandemics that we have at the moment, and our biodiversity loss. So we all have to work very strongly together, otherwise the tipping points are there. And so please take it very seriously. I now don't want to wait my colleague Anya. She will now lead the second session of this very interesting workshop. And I say thank you very much, and I hand over to Anya.
Well, thank you, Manuela. Good morning, everyone, and good evening for our Australian guests. Welcome to the second part of this event, in which we will focus on a specific aspect of the trade between EU and Australia. It's the trade in products derived from the commercial kangaroo hunting in Australia. My name is Anja Hazekamp. I'm the president of the Animal Welfare Intergroup, and I'm so thrilled to host this part of this event, as I consider this issue very, very relevant. In March 2018, I also hosted the screening of the documentary Kangaroo, A Love-Hate Story at the European Parliament. And three of the panelists that are with us today, Mick McIntyre, Mark Pearson, and Dr. Droor Ben-Ami, were in Brussels then to tell us about the problems with the kangaroo hunting in Australia. And at that time, I was so shocked to discover that we, European citizens, play a major role in the slaughtering of millions of wild kangaroos every year, as the EU is the biggest importer of kangaroo meat and skins in the world. The scientific bureau of my party, the Party for the Animals, decided then to contribute to the kangaroo meat analysis in the Netherlands that will be mentioned by our panelists. We found that the meat was contaminated, confirming similar results in Germany and Australia. But this is not only a health issue. It is first of all a cruel practice involving huge suffering and not corresponding to the already largely insufficient European and Australian animal welfare standards. Our panelists will explain why. Ilaria Di Silvestre, a wildlife program leader at Eurogroup for Animals, will help moderate the debate. If you have questions to our panelists, please feel free to write them down in the Q&A box. Well, now I'm happy to introduce to you our first speaker, Mick McIntyre. He is the co-director of the documentary Kangaroo, A Love-Hate Story. Mick has spent 35 years in the film industry, where he combines his skills as a cinematographer with producing and directing. His work includes several award-winning feature films, including the movie Kangaroo, A Love-Hate Story, of which we now will see a short extract. Mick, nice to see you again. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Anja, and thank you so much for the invitation. Yes, I have been asked to show some clips from our film, Kangaroo, A Love-Hate Story. Some background, my partner Kate and I, we're independent filmmakers based here in Sydney, Australia, and we run a successful film production company. We have spent the last 6 years researching, filming, and releasing the film Kangaroo, A Love-Hate Story. When we started production, we were inundated with whistleblower accounts of people witnessing the commercial kangaroo shooters in action. And it was our job as filmmakers to put these eyewitness testimonies into the film. We also travelled extensively across Australia, interviewing key stakeholders involved with kangaroos. We interviewed farmers, politicians, commercial shooters, scientists, activists, and academics. And for those who have seen the film will know that all sides of the kangaroo issue are well represented in our 95-minute film. The film was released to rave reviews around the world, and it's won many awards, including being considered for the 2019 Academy Awards. The film, when it was released, shocked audiences all over the world. When the film was released in Europe, as you just heard from Anja, we were approached by Anja to screen the film in the EU Parliament. And from that screening, we were introduced to the Eurogroup for Animals, who are now releasing this report tonight. Two things that we exposed, or two things that we learned in the production of the film and therefore exposed in the film, have caused the biggest reaction. The cruelty, the animal welfare aspects of the commercial killing of kangaroos, and, as Anja mentioned, the contamination of the kangaroo meat from the commercial kangaroo industry. So the 2-minute clip I'm about to show you are an example of these issues. In these clips, you'll see kangaroos being shot by commercial shooters, cut up and butchered in the dusty, dirty outback, heads and intestines left in the field, bodies of kangaroos left in the back of a truck for several hours in the heat. These are all things that we witnessed as in the making of this film. You will see clips of baby joeys left to die beside their abandoned mothers, all as a result of the commercial killing of kangaroos. We have spared you the worst of the footage because we just didn't think we could show it to you tonight, but that is of the baby joeys being ripped from their mother's pouches and bashed to death on the bull bars of the cars of the shooters. And all the clips you'll see are from the commercial shooting of kangaroos. Now, we've seen correspondence from the Australian government telling people that the commercial kangaroo industry is well regulated and follows a code of practice. Well, that wasn't our experience in making the film. I mean, we witnessed firsthand that it's almost impossible to monitor the commercial shooting of kangaroos. It's done at night, it's done in the middle of nowhere. And so it was our experience of witnessing no monitoring. Logistically, it is almost impossible to monitor the commercial shooting of kangaroos in the Australian bush. As I've mentioned, as professional filmmakers, it is our job to portray what we uncover. And we are very proud of the film's success. The film's trailer has been viewed more than 2 million times, and the film has been streamed by thousands of people online around the world. And we urge everyone to watch the film. And it is now available streaming on major sites like iTunes and Google Play. And finally, I'm just going to finish by saying we've also seen correspondence from the Australian government talking about our film, suggesting that the film does not represent the commercial kangaroo industry, that it is merely footage from recreational weekend hunters. I can assure the audience tonight that this is not true and is outrageous to suggest otherwise, and a blight on our reputation as professional filmmakers. Our film is the first time that people get to see eyewitness accounts of the commercial killing of kangaroos. We will now watch the 2-minute clips. Just give me a minute as I share my screen.
Thank you so much, Mick, for sharing this heartbreaking footage with us. I'm still speechless. And so I will immediately go to our next speaker. I would like to warmly welcome the Honourable Mark Pearson, my colleague and friend from the Animal Justice Party, a part of the growing movement of political parties that are working together on the rights of animals in politics, in public administration, and in society. He is the first member of the Australian Parliament to be elected on an animal protection platform and a member of the New South Wales Council. He has been engaged in animal advocacy for 22 years, most recently lobbying against the kangaroo meat trade. Mark, good to see you again. The floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Great to see you, Anja, again. Well, what we're seeing is a wet market in Australia. This is Australia's wet market. And as you could just see from those short images, what you're seeing is a situation where animals are being shot, eviscerated, out in the open, at night time, temperatures up to 38 ambient degrees during summer. So how I first became, how this major issue first came to my attention was actually a kangaroo shooter. And then another kangaroo shooter contacted me and said, this industry is totally out of control. It cannot be regulated. And to quote him, listen, mate, if you're going to eat that kangaroo shit, you be crazy. Because the story is, and as was referred to briefly in the clip from the documentary, is that this is the reality. The shooter starts his truck at 6 p.m. He shoots his first kangaroo at 7 p.m., let's say, on a typical night of shooting. Cuts the head off. Why? Eviscerates the kangaroo on the back of his truck, cuts off parts of the legs, and that kangaroo stays hanging on the back of that truck for up to 12 to 14 hours, bouncing around with dust, with urine and feces from other animals and kangaroos blowing up behind the truck into the cavity of the kangaroo carcass, bouncing around for all those hours while he shoots another one, and then is the long 2 to 3, 4 hour trip to the chiller. And they get to the chiller, they must be at the chiller 1 hour after dawn. Wet market. You couldn't get any closer. In fact, it's probably even worse than some aspects of the wet market in Wuhan, Guangzhou, and Africa. So then the kangaroo gets put onto the truck. It can stay on that chiller truck, rammed in tightly. Dr. Draw Benamy's seen this, and I've seen this, where we open the doors of a chiller, which is really just an old shipping container, and the kangaroos bounce out towards you, all packed in, skin on skin. The temperature is supposed to reach 7 degrees or less for 2 weeks. It doesn't. It can't. Then a truck comes to pick up the kangaroos from the chiller and may travel for 2 to 3 days, apparently in a refrigerated truck, going to chiller to chiller to chiller and taking these carcasses to 2 of the major processing plants for exports. And because the contamination became so apparent through all of the tests that were done of E. coli, salmonella, they decided to pickle it with acetic acid. Now, acetic acid is just used to remove certain contaminations in abattoirs, but it's not a routine practice. And now, of course, because they knew acetic acid was going to be a problem for Europe, they're using lactic acid, which of course has been exposed in your report. So here is an industry which can't show the world what they're really doing to the kangaroos, because they're killing them in the outback, and they won't let us see the heads, which will show whether they've had a clean shot to the brain or not. But what the shooters have told me, no, they're shot in the jaw, they're shot in the neck, and this is why they cut off the head. It's the dirtiest, dark little secret of the great southern land. And it is a dangerous industry. It's even dangerous for the workers who are working in it by themselves in the outback, having to lift these heavy carcasses. You know, there's a situation which probably Dr. Draw Benamy will refer to. I think this is an extremely telling of what this industry gets away with. Sometimes when we have a flood in Australia, we get a problem with kangaroos. They develop a disease which causes blindness. We still don't know what causes this blindness. But does the industry stop? No. They still shoot kangaroos, even though there's been an outbreak of something causing blindness, and they process them, send them off to Europe for consumption, and we don't know what that disease is. Now, if this was to happen to a herd of cattle in Australia or a mob of sheep, there is no way in the whole wide world would they allow those sheep to be put on truck and sent into slaughter if they were suffering from a disease or blindness where we don't even know what's causing it. It would be totally unacceptable on any standard of hygiene standards in Australia, around the world. But that is what is happening. So I'll be brief now. We took all this information to Russia and to Europe. I came to see Neil Parrish. I think he was a representative of the I forget his name now, Andrea Gabrielli. So this is way back in 2007, 2006, 2007. So that's when we made the first approaches to Europe. And there was clearly concern then, but obviously the evidence had to be built up over time, layer upon layer, not only in our backyard in Australia, but in the work you've done in Europe. But Russia, they took some tests of a shipment that arrived in Vladivostok, found high amount of salmonella, E. coli, feces, and antibiotic spray. So they shut down 75% of the imports, and they were the largest importer at the time. They were responsible for 70% of imports in 2008, and then in 2009 shut the whole industry imports into Russia. The main reason, I mean, they were concerned about welfare, but the main reason, and this was said very clearly to us by the head veterinarian who oversees Rosenkaltatsor, which is the umbrella body looking at hygiene and imports of meat and also animal welfare, was that we have to protect the citizens, the people of Russia, from a disease, an outbreak of something which could come as a consequence of this. So I am really grateful that we are actually having this conference, and extremely grateful that the report has now been released, which just corroborates the evidence we've been gathering since 2006, 14 years ago, and still, despite the industry being shocked, almost brought to its knees by the Russian ban, China not taking up imports, the industry, if they could get it right, even the hygiene part of it, you wouldn't be finding lactic acid in the meat in Europe. That's the measure of the danger of this export and import. And then, of course, the animal welfare side of it is just like the baby harp seals on the white snow being beaten to death, but that's in the broad daylight of day for the world to see. This is happening at a larger scale, as you saw in some images in the film, out in the outback, 300 or 400 kilometers away from any regulator. And that's the dirty, dark secret, which I'm begging the EU to put aside. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, for your presentation. I have the great pleasure to introduce now to you our next speaker, Uncle Max Dulu Munmun Harrison, who is an Aboriginal elder of the Huon Nation from the south coast of New South Wales. Uncle Max is highly respected teacher and leader in all aspects of Aboriginal culture. He has worked closely with the University of Technology Group THINK, the think tank on kangaroos, on raising awareness about the importance and plight of kangaroos. He has also interviewed extensively on the subjects in the press and in the movie Kangaroo, A Love-Hate Story. Uncle Max will now introduce an indigenous perspective on the kangaroo industry. Please, Uncle Max, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Anja. Can you hear me? Thank you. I'm Mark Mick Draw. Look, kangaroos. We were eating kangaroos for thousands of years. But the reason that we ate kangaroos for thousands of years is because we never had refrigeration. So when we done a kill, the kangaroo was gun, and lots of parts of the kangaroo was utilized for many, many different artifacts. And because, as I said, when we done the kill, the meal was pretty well close to be cooked. So it never gave the kangaroo time to get how to get any disease. Because when the kangaroo did roam this country that's called Australia, there were no contaminations on the land as there is today. There are planes that drop. I don't know what they drop, but you see it falling from the sky. Things to make the grass grow. So that the sheep and cattle can eat. But that's just like our bodies. When the kangaroo eats that, they become contaminated also. So it makes it hard for us indigenous people. We don't know where these things have been dropped around and baited around. It's such a horrific thing about this killing of the kangaroos. It's not killing, a slaughter. And a senseless slaughter, as you see in the film. See, we have many animals. And most of our animals, our Australian animals, have padded feet, not hooved feet, like cattle, sheep, goats, horses, and all those are hoof animals. Now the horses was now passed in the New South Wales Parliament as an iconic animal. What a joke. And in the film you'll see, if you watch it, and when you watch it, you'll see this farmer there whinging about the kangaroo, ruining his land. And he's standing amongst sheep with dust flying up around him. The insanity of the thinking that these aardvark animals are a better replacement for the padded kangaroo. We lost millions of animals this year in the fires. Our dingoes are still been shot. And they should be put on the endangered species list. The kangaroo count is so false and is humane, or what they even think it is. So we have this iconic animal that's a symbol of the parliaments of this country, which seems to be a joke to me. The hypocrisy of it. A kangaroo one side of a shield and an emu the other side, but yet they're not being protected. This I cannot understand. This is something that really blows my 84-year-old mind away. The insanity of the reason of these things. But it's the cruelty and how it's done to take these are the iconic animals. Not the aardvark animals, who is endangering our rivers in our greatest sponge, the Snowy Mountains. It's cutting the water off. Aardvark animals. deer, cattle, goats. I don't know why I told you this, but I'm just telling you the hypocrisy of one animal to the other. See, our people were invaded. Now, our traditional animals are being invaded and killed and slaughtered. I've watched this, and I didn't know how I can talk to people. I didn't know who I could talk to. I was talking to deaf ears when I was talking, until I met a young man in the university. His name is Drew. Then I met another young man who made a film, and his name is Mick. And that's when I met Honorable Mark Pearson. And I knew then that I could have a voice with these people. They took me to China to talk about the animals. And that's where I was questioned by one of the Chinese hierarchy men. I didn't know his status. And he said to me, "Why do you not want us to eat your kangaroo?" I said, "You would not want me to eat your panda bear, would you?" So I hope that something works over there just to stop the slaughter of these iconic indigenous animals. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Uncle Max, for not only showing us telling us about the hypocrisy and the cruelty of the kangaroo hunt, but also pointing out that the livestock industry is not only polluting our environment and threatening our biodiversity, but also threatens the indigenous culture. Thank you for that. And let me assure you that your voice is being heard.
Thank you.
Please now welcome our next speaker, Dr. Dror Ben-Ami, biologist specialized in wildlife and marsupials. Dror is the co-founder of THINK, the think tank for kangaroos at the University of Technology Sydney, the Center for Compassionate Conservation at UTS, and Compassionate Conservation Middle East at Tel Aviv University. Dror, it's great to see you again. You have 10 minutes to further explain the conservation, the welfare and hygiene issues related to the kangaroo industry.
Thank you, Anya. Big thank you to Uncle Max. Actually got a bit emotional hearing him speak. We've had a very long friendship that precedes kangaroos, actually just trying to learn from each other. I'm Jewish and he's Aboriginal, and we were trying to learn about each other's culture, and that's how it started. We've gone a long way together, teaching each other, I think, a little bit along the way. I think I've learned more. And also a big thank you to Mick and Kate, who you don't see there, but the other half, really putting everything on the line for this, bringing this dark secret, as Mark Pearson calls it, to the audiences in Europe and elsewhere. The risk is not just financial, it's also really physical, to be honest. It is a dangerous industry. I knew it before Mick knew it. I knew it because Mark Pearson knew it. When we worked together in the Outback and Mark wanted to show me what this secret was. And once he did, I never looked back. I'll just preface, a lot of what I want to say has kind of been said by the various speakers, so I don't need to go into great detail, but I will go into some numbers, which are interesting. But I want to say that the reason I got involved in this issue of kangaroos is because I come from a lab at the University of New South Wales. My supervisor was Dr. David Croft. My colleague, I think he's online here, Dr. Daniel Ramp, and several others, researchers. We specialize in kangaroos, and there are different species of kangaroos. And we had cumulative experience of probably now over 100 years of kangaroo research. And whilst we were told the kangaroos are pests, I mean, what we heard at university and in popular media, our science, the research that we were putting out from the university, from the research station that we have, which is a sheep station that has all the 4 kangaroo species on it, showed that kangaroos are not really competing with livestock, or very little, just in drought, for resources, which meant that the whole notion that kangaroos are overabundant, that they're pests, was really not based in fact, not based in science. We later found out that kangaroos are also not really reliant on water that much. Their populations are not influenced by the water sources for livestock. So that took away that element as well of saying, oh, because of us, there's so many kangaroos out there. And that is why we went on this long journey that started, for me, it started 13, 14 years ago, of saying we need to put the information out there, which is counter to Australian culture, about what the science is showing us about kangaroos. And we wanted also to show this information to countries around the world that were taking the kangaroo products, meat and skins, from Australia, because half of the products are in Australia and half are sold internationally. And that's how we got to where we are now. And I'll now just share my presentation. I won't go through all the slides, but I'll go through some of the things that I think are really important. And just give me a second as I share my screen. Can you see my screen? Am I shared? Yeah, okay. So just to go again, to show again that the Europe really is the biggest importer of kangaroo products in the world. More than half of what is being sent internationally: Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, France. And this is important because it's not only the amount, which is the greatest, but also the value. The value of the meat sold in Europe is substantially greater than, say, in Papua New Guinea or some of the other countries. And therefore, Europe is a very lucrative market, and also sets a certain standard of ethical standard. If Europe is okay with eating kangaroos, then it's okay for the rest of the world. A lot of the world is still oriented that way. And so we think that it's really important that Europeans, set an example of ethical engagement with wildlife that should not include eating wildlife. Eating wildlife, especially terrestrial wildlife, is a thing of the past almost. And so it's important that the Europeans take this on. The 4 species of kangaroos that are being commercially killed, it's not just one kangaroo. It's the eastern gray kangaroo, western gray kangaroo, red kangaroo, wallaroo. And therefore, when we say, oh, there are so many kangaroos, or, oh, the numbers have dropped, it's not the one kangaroo. There are 4 different species, each with its unique habitat, each with its unique requirements Some occur in large numbers, some occur in smaller numbers, and therefore it's important to realize there are 4 different species of kangaroos. At different points, there was real concern back in the 70s about the red kangaroo because it was being overly culled. There have been concerns about the wallaroo at different stages because it's an animal that's very it's cryptic. It's an animal that lives on its own, not in large groups, solitary, and therefore doesn't occur in high numbers. And quite occasionally, the shooting of these animals needs to stop in order to let them recover. Again, these are wildlife. And finally, in terms of the idea that kangaroos are overabundant, what we do know about kangaroos is that their populations are driven mostly by rainfall. So amount of rainfall determines how many kangaroos there will be in the landscape. It's the best predictor. Competition with sheep is negligible on account of a few studies. The culling of kangaroos on wool stations in particular, but also cattle stations, has been measured to have very little impact on productivity of the farm. In terms of the damage caused by kangaroos, the commercial damage caused by kangaroos to farms, because of the new data that has come out since the mid-90s, the assessment has dropped dramatically from 270 million Australian dollars per year to 40 million Australian dollars per year throughout the whole of Australia. And so that impact is not very great, considering Australia as a continent, the number of farms, etc. This is the largest commercial killing of wildlife in the world in terms of sustainability. Kangaroos are still there. I'm not saying that they've gone, but there's no other industry like it for terrestrial wildlife. The only comparable industry is that of fish in the ocean. Interestingly, as fish populations are disappearing, the sampling of kangaroos is not that different from fish. Fish sampled from the ocean, a small sample presumably shows how many fish there are. With kangaroos, they're sampled from the air, and only a tiny amount of the actual population is seen or observed from the air, less than 1%. And from that, there are extrapolations to the scale, the size of the landscape. And we get from several hundred kangaroos, we might get several 100,000 kangaroos as an estimate. And these are the estimates that are being used to assess how many kangaroos are there and to determine the quotas of how many kangaroos should be killed. But to my mind and other biologists' mind, these estimates are not precise. They're actually quite inaccurate. Today, to save money, kangaroo populations are sampled once every 3 years, not every year as it used to be, and that increases the concern about their the population status, particularly because when there are years of drought, populations can drop by about 40% in less than half a year. And therefore, it's not okay to sample populations every 3 years and say that we have a sustainable and well-regulated industry in terms of conservation. Spoken a lot about the welfare of kangaroos. This is a huge issue from 2000 to 2009. 800,000 young kangaroos that are not part of the industry, they're just waste, were clubbed on the head or died of predation, dehydration, starvation as a consequence of killing mothers. In recent years, these numbers have dropped quite a bit because the kangaroo industry has taken on itself, not through government, to kill only males. But still, we have 200,000 young, about 200,000 young, this is an extrapolation, being killed in that same horrific manner every year. And by the way, this is now changing. The kangaroo industry, especially New South Wales in particular, has given up and now they're killing females again, so the numbers are going up. Let me remind you that the EU banned harp seals at the time when 300,000 harp seals in total were being killed per year. So we have, 800,000 to 200,000 young that are collateral waste being bludgeoned to death every year, and EU is taking on these kangaroos that are caught, and causing that is a big part of that, the reason why this happens. I like to say that the kangaroo industry prides itself on a single shot to the brain, that shooters are trained. That is not exactly the case. I mean, they do have to pass a test, but even the RSPCA testing of top shooters, you know, this is biased testing. The shooters know they're being tested, show that they're about 2% or so of kangaroos are being not shot in the head, missed shot, which would be about 50,000 kangaroos per year based on today's 1.6 million kangaroos killed per year. But when we've observed the number of kangaroos in chillers and the way that they were killed, we've had an expert estimate up to 400,000 kangaroos being killed, 40% of adult kangaroos not being shot in the head. And mind you that shooters are not inclined to bring in carcasses to the processing plants that have not been shot in the head, because they're not accepted. So if you miss a kangaroo, it's much better to leave it in the field than to bring it in. So again, the numbers are probably higher than what we're showing you. And this is not a well-regulated industry. And there are indications that really there are horrific effects on adult kangaroos, not just the young. In terms of hygiene, Mark Pearson described it really well. There are multiple conditions of kangaroos in the field after drought and after wet seasons, where they have multiple diseases causing blindness, neurological, other neurological issues. And kangaroos, you know, they're still being processed. Well, we don't know what causes these conditions. We found in independent testing high levels of Salmonella and E. coli that are indicators that the meat is super contaminated. Toxoplasmosis is also very frequent in kangaroo in kangaroo feces and in kangaroo, occasionally found in kangaroo meat, has affected individuals. And the reason this happens, as you saw in the video, when during the gutting of the kangaroo in the field, some of the gut contents spill onto the muscle tissue. And this is when the contamination occurs. The shooters are not regulated in the field. They work in the dark. They're only minimally trained. They're not butchers. This is not even done in South Africa and Namibia, where there's also game meat. It's actually not done in Europe either, I don't think. The situation where minimally trained hunters eviscerate an animal and then are not regulated is unthinkable in today's terms of preserving hygiene and being on the lookout for pathogens. This should not happen, and it only happens really because the industry is trying to save money, not have refrigeration on trucks, not bringing in shot kangaroos to a central point where they can be supervised by butchers, as is being done in South Africa and Namibia. The hunters bring the animals, the large animals, to a central location, and then the butchering is supervised. This is a cowboy industry in Australia, and Europeans, you know, the European Parliament, the EU Commission is, by allowing this to happen, is subjecting European citizens to great risk, in my opinion. Of course, you know that it was banned in Russia due to hygiene concerns. So lastly, I'm just about finished, but I want you to keep in mind that Australia has its own ethics. And until the 1970s, it was a whaling nation. Actually, for many years, over the last 150 years, whaling was the biggest industry in Australia. It was very profitable. Whale oil was profitable. And only when whales started disappearing from the oceans and became unprofitable that that the industry stopped. And then a subsequent inquiry then raised up the issues that Australia should be the nation to oppose whaling. And Australia decided to sue Japan for whaling. But what a hypocrisy. I mean, what's the difference between whaling and the kangaroo industry? I put to you that there is none, and it's just a matter of convenience. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Dror. Well, for showing us how inaccurate the population estimations are and how big the animal welfare issues, but also the hygiene problems with kangaroo meat are. This alone would be enough reason to ban the imports of kangaroo meat in the European Union, I say. Let me introduce our next speaker to you, Ilaria Di Silvestre. She's a biologist. She's specialized in wildlife conservation, and she is wildlife program leader at Eurogroup for Animals. Ilaria will present the role of the European Union in the commercial kangaroo hunting and launch Eurogroup for Animals' new report entitled Kangaroo from Australian Icon to Meat and Luxury Leather for the EU. Ilaria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anya, and good morning, everyone. And thank you to the previous speakers for the very interesting and informative information they shared. I will try to share my screen now. Okay. Okay, so I'm very pleased today to present our new report that it has been prepared in collaboration with several of our member organizations, which summarize a little bit the information that you already heard this morning, present evidences, and also introduce our call for a new ban. The report is now available starting from today in our website. This is the link. Please download it and read it and share it. I will just present the main findings very quickly of the report. As mentioned by Dror, the EU is the main market for kangaroo exports. And for the meat, the main importers are Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, and France, while for the hides, skins, and leather, Italy and Germany are the main one. However, is all this meat that we are importing unhealthy meat? As mentioned by Dror again, is not the case, but we wanted to test what was the situation here in Europe, and with support of our member organization, Gaia, Fondation Brigitte Bardot, Deutsche Tierschutzbund, and also with the Party of the Animals, Dutch Party of the Animals, which of course is not a member of Eurogroup. The test has been made in meat that was purchased in supermarkets and by retailers in Belgium, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. And in Germany and the Netherlands, the results show a contamination with Escherichia coli. And in all the samples, a high concentration of lactic acid has been identified. Now, lactic acid is nothing dangerous in se. It's naturally present in the meat. But at this concentration, this clearly indicates that it has been added. And as you heard before, lactic acid is added to wash the meat and when it's highly contaminated. And indeed, EFSA stressed the fact that it should not be used to wash and in order to clean the highly contaminated meat, because it's not fully effective, as this result indeed shows, because contamination has been found also in meat that has been treated with lactic acid. So indeed, in Australia, most of the meat is used for pet food, while in Europe, 50% of the imported meat is used for human consumption, 50% for pet food. So it's not an healthy meat. Also from another point of view, Dror also mentioned the risk coming for fragments of bullets present in the meat. We found that this label in the meat purchased in France warning consumers about the potential presence of fragments of bullets. And the bullets used in Australia are lead bullets. And we all know how toxic lead is for people's health and for the environment as well, to the point that several member states are banned the use of lead bullet, and the EU itself is really discussing exactly in these days, a ban at EU level on the use of lead bullets. Now, coming to the later, our Italian member organization, LAV, investigated with the manufacturers in Italy
what was the reason why kangaroo leather was used for high performance sporting equipment or luxury product. And the manufacturers answered that kangaroo leather is irrepressible for high performance and because it's strong and light. So lab wanted to test if this was true or not and sent samples of an equivalent synthetic material to a certified laboratory to make some tests. And it was found that this was not true because most of the quality of the kangaroo leather were also present in the synthetic material. And if an NGO with, of course, a limited budget in a few samples already identified an acceptable substitute, the industry could definitely invest some more money to identify a very good substitute, even better, offering even better characteristics than the kangaroo leather. So thanks to the campaign of our member organization and also to the fact that Pro-Wildlife from Germany, it's a German NGO, joined the campaign, several supermarkets started to stop selling kangaroo meat. In Belgium, all supermarkets stopped selling kangaroo meat, several in France and Germany as well. Also some producer of pet food stopped to use meat, and some luxury manufacturers like Prada, Versace, Ferragamo stopped to use kangaroo leather. These, of course, are very good news for kangaroos, but it can't be the solution. The solutions will only be a new ban. And the EU has all the mandate to adopt a restriction in products that are potentially dangerous to the health of EU citizens, like this meat. And also, what we have seen and heard this morning, it's not compatible with our standards and with our values, and indeed what is in our treaty. And because the treaty of the EU recognizes that animals are sentient beings and that we should pay full regard to their welfare. And there's also precedent for that because the EU already adopted a ban on seafood exactly for animal welfare reason, and because it was impossible to substitute the way or to replace the way of killing with a more humane way, exactly as it happens with kangaroo hunting. So commercial kangaroo hunting is a particularly unhygienic and cruel industry, not complying with European animal welfare and sanitary standards. So we need a new ban on all goods derived from the hunting of kangaroos. Thank you for your attention, and please read our report. And in case of any question, we'll be very happy to answer. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ilaria, for the presentation of the new report. I will definitely go read it later today, and I hope many of my colleagues will do so too. With us today are also some representatives of the European Commission. I'm sure the participants today are very interested in hearing what the Commission has to say on the issues that are raised. And we have heard serious concerns regarding food safety, animal welfare, regarding the imports of kangaroo meat. And what I'm really curious, what has the Commission done so far on this issue since it was raised in the Parliament several years ago? And personally, I think there are some similarities with the ethical concerns that the EU has expressed against the seal hunting. And it was already pointed out by Mark Pearson, by Dr. Dror Ben-Ami, by Ilaria Di Silvestre. Both during the seal hunt and during the kangaroo hunt, the welfare of animals, especially very young animals, is severely affected. And does the Commission see possibilities to ban import of kangaroo meat based on ethical grounds? Or otherwise, do you see possibilities based on the hygiene problems with kangaroo meat? And do you think that the ongoing negotiations with Australia in the free trade agreement offer a concrete opportunity to address this issue? A lot of questions, so I don't know who is willing to answer, but maybe Nick Weller or Nicolas, please take the floor.
Hello, are you hearing acceptably well? Okay, so I mean, it is really very useful to get this information because, you know, we are in Brussels in an office and we do not get, we cannot go on the ground. Of course, we have our inspectors that go, and if
Nicola, we cannot hear you anymore. So maybe there's a small issue with your mic. Can you double check? It was working at the beginning, but it has stopped working. Maybe my suggestion, Nicola, could be that you quit the event and rejoin it. And in the meantime, maybe Anya, we could go to Joanna Granger for Australia, and then we could listen to the commission afterwards.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a good suggestion. The representative of the Australian mission to the EU, Ms. Granger, please can you give a reaction, tell us your position?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Look, I listened with interest to all of the speakers talking about this important issue. It is the case that kangaroos are a much loved icon of Australia. The Australian government and the Australian community take the welfare of kangaroos very seriously. We think there is a comprehensive legal framework and management approach by the Australian government and the state and territory governments to this important issue, and this information is publicly available. So, for instance, each state and territory that does look to export kangaroo product has a science-based management plan. And the monitoring and compliance frameworks for the animal welfare all demonstrate our strong commitment to a sustainable and humane harvest. And it's got lots of robust checks and balances. Importantly, there's been no adverse effect on the long-term kangaroo population have been identified, and that's after more than 30 years of a commercial kangaroo management. And obviously this time frame has included several periods of severe drought, and drought is obviously a major effect on kangaroo populations. In terms of the food safety issues that people have been raising, I would like to point to a recent audit by the European Commission that found that Australia's kangaroo industry meets the EU's stringent food safety and animal welfare requirements. I'd like to refer people to report DG Sante 2019-6679. That report is publicly available, and the kangaroo meat industry passed with flying colours. So it is the case that we do have robust checks and balances. It is important to understand that the kangaroo harvesting and processing export industry is subject to audits, just like the one I've just talked about. That kangaroo meat is safe and wholesome to eat when it has been produced and handled in accordance with good manufacturing and hygienic practices. And it's important that these practices are maintained along the supply chain, including consumers following the cooking instructions. Obviously, the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment is the competent authority that oversights the export certification of this product. And through our certification and the checks and balances, we are confidently certifying that we are meeting the EU's stringent food safety and animal welfare requirements. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. We now try again Mr. Nicolas Guth from the European Commission. Please, can you tell us something about the audits and tell us why the results that are found by the Commission differ so much from the other findings we heard about in the presentation, and which were also done by certified laboratories?
I try again. Hello, do you hear at the moment? Is it better now?
Yes, thank you. It's working. It's working well now. Okay. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I want to say there are two issues. The one is the legal framework, and then these animal welfare observations, which are also indeed striking. But from the legal possibility of the Commission, we have to take our EU legislation, and hunting is not regulated in the EU as well, and it is done by the member states. So for imports, we have some very basic rules on animal welfare for the killing and this part, but not for the raising and the housing. And this is well known. And so Stephanie said it in the beginning that the strongest tool actually the killing part. So as indeed there was an audit last year, and it fulfilled the EU requirements. This is indeed the case. But of course, I mean, this is the records. You know how audits are done. Based on records, they go on the ground and they fulfill it. And of course, they are not there. They can only take a subsample, and that's, of course, maybe they perform well during that time, but at other times not. But we have to take this objective audit as the the reference for the assessment. I wanted to say some word on this hygienic issue. The fact that there are some E. coli on the meat does not mean that it is not fulfilling the EU food safety requirements, because E. coli is an indicator on fresh meat, well understood, but it's not a food safety requirement. And if, as one can assume, there is a normal cooking or frying or what, there is no direct food safety risk more than with other meat that we consume. This is just for a basic clarification. So another issue is, I mean, immediately, as already in 2018, the issue was raised, and we have immediately asked clarification from Australia, from the competent authorities, and we have received always this information, and is also part of the audit which has been done. So on that basis, we would confirm that the Australian authorities have cooperated well with us in the terms of competent authorities. So in that respect, for the moment, we have not an objective basis for banning, for making a change. But so that's just an assessment that we have at this stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your clarifications. I hope that we, in the discussion, maybe we can hear some answers about the banning of products on ethical grounds, like we did with the seal products, and maybe something about lactic acid. I now first go to Ilaria to see if there are some questions which he will moderate.
Yes, thank you, Anya, and thank you for the answer from the Commission. We consider that not all our issues have been answered indeed, and really invite you to read the report and the fact also that this meat is regularly washed with lactic acid, which should not be an addictive to the fresh game meat, according to the EU legislation, is also something that should be considered. And in general, I think that the findings and the evidence we provided clearly show that there are issues. So if the audit didn't assess, didn't identify that issue, maybe it would be better to rediscuss and see why, because I mean, these are evidence that we provided today, especially about the animal welfare point of view and health as well. Okay. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to answer the question because we are very late, and we apologize for that. Maybe I can ask just one the question we received. I don't know who will answer, probably Dror. Is the fact that these animals are killed in so cruel a way is something that could be improved and then avoided without the need for a ban, but just simply maybe adopting a code of conduct, more strict code of conduct, or a training to the hunters, so that this can be addressed in some way, improving the method that maybe Dror can answer. And I will ask, there's someone of you, the open microphone, maybe is Nicholas good? If you can close your microphone, please. Thank you very much. Dror, if you can answer.
I think this issue is similar to the harp seals and the difficulty with finding an alternative. The kangaroos are wild; they're not farmed, and the hunting occurs at night because that's when the kangaroos are active, and the conditions are such that it makes it very difficult to approach the animals. You cannot be captured physically, so they need to be shot from a distance. The industry attempted to not kill females, but still, you know, at its best, it had 200,000 joeys still dying as a consequence. And it doesn't work because if only males are killed, it actually in many cases, it drives local populations up because it's the one big male that usually controls a whole mob of females, especially in eastern gray kangaroos. When that big male is killed, then the smaller males mate and then create more young. So it's not that's also not a practical solution for the industry and the farmers in particular. So I don't see a way around it. I can see a way of improving the hygiene element, certainly, but that would create a much increase in cost to the industry. We need refrigeration, would need carcasses brought to collection centers with butchers, trained butchers on site. So that probably could improve.
Thank you, Dror. And a last quick question. We received can we get an answer from the Commission on what Anya asked about the position of an import ban, like for the import ban on seal products? Can maybe Nicholas answer this question? If there's a possibility to consider this for the same reason why the seal ban was adopted?
Yes. Can you hear again? Yes.
Yes.
Of course. This can always be considered in general, as it was done for the seals, on ethical grounds, as it was said before. At the moment, there is no intention to do this. On DG Sante's side, that's what I have received. So far, it's not yet considered. As already said, we see that Australia is cooperating to the extent possible. And also objectively, the audits, so they follow the procedures, at least in the audits, as we have seen. So that's the basis between competent authorities as we address it. If for political reasons and there would be something, that's then another issue. But strictly from DG Sante's side, we think that we should resolve it on cooperation level to improve situations. And I also consider that Australia is open to do what they can do and to improve wherever it is possible, although it is understood that kangaroos it's a wild in the same way as it's also wild in Europe. So it's more difficult than to have husbandry under farmers' conditions going to the slaughterhouse. That must be understood. So that's the current situation, what I can report. Yes, thank you. Well, maybe one point I missed to say something. On this lactic acid issue, this is true. So at the moment, the imports should not have been treated with lactic acid. as it is not yet an approved decontaminant for kangaroo meat. So this, but we have no official testing from member states that would confirm this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Interesting information. Thank you. And Anya, I guess we don't have time for any further questions because we are really already quite late. So maybe we should close. Up to you.
Well, maybe we can do one more question because I don't know what questions came in, but I saw a lot of interesting questions. Do you have one more or shall we close the meeting?
Okay, now we have one that is quite interesting indeed. Is if the Australian government are so confident that the code of conduct is being abided by, will they commit $1,000 to every wildlife carrier who has to raise a shooting orphan? As someone who lost my home and sanctuary in the bushfires, it isn't time to stop the slaughter until a real and accurate kangaroo count can be conducted. I think it's an interesting point of view for someone that is living there and experiencing the issue. Maybe Joanna can answer. I don't know if it's an answer that you can provide, but what's your opinion on that?
That's really a matter that I think that person would need to raise with the Australian government and their local members of parliament. That's not a matter I can comment on.
I could certainly comment on it if you like. I mean, it's extraordinary to think that we lost so many millions and billions of animals during the drought and then the fires. And yet, without us even knowing how many animals are left, including obviously kangaroos, it is unconscionable for the government, whether federal or state or territory, to continue to issue permits to kill and harm kangaroos. I mean, Animals Australia and also myself and animal organisations have written to the relevant ministers to say, to ask them to just hold a moratorium on the killing of these kangaroos until we know what devastation has occurred for them. I mean, that's a measure of the insensitivity and the illogic way that the industry functions. So the fact that that hasn't been taken up is extraordinary.
I can just comment on that bit. Thank you so much. I was understanding the question perhaps incorrectly. It is the case that state and territories who undertake state management plans do an annual population survey, and they do adjust these. So for the callers on the line and people interested today, I can let people know that state and territory governments have been considering their management plans and adjusting them accordingly in cases where local kangaroo populations were adversely affected by the fires. And more generally, the state governments do adjust their harvest quotas and areas from time to time to ensure that the harvest remains sustainable. So some examples of that is 2 states reduced the kangaroo harvest quotas in November. That was happening in Australia at that time. And one of those was also reducing the area of the permitted harvest zone. I understand that South Australia and Victoria in particular looked again following the bushfires in relation to the annual harvest quotas and the population management. So it is a nimble process. It's a case where it's not set and forget. The state management plans are being actively monitored, and there has actually been a response in relation to the commercial cull from that.
Can I just jump in there and just state that the government of New South Wales, which was drastically affected by the fires, 25% of New South Wales bushland was destroyed by the fires. That is kangaroo habitat. And I can just say that the 2020 quota by the New South Wales government increased from the 2019 quota. I'd just like to point that out. So basically, after the recent fires of last summer, the New South Wales government announced an increased quota. I'd just like to point that out. Thanks.
Thank you, Mick.
Thank you.
And that says it all, I think, when you really look at it.
No, I agree.
Now.
It doesn't make any sense, and I think we could discuss for this about this topic for many more hours, but our time is running out. So I would like to close this meeting, but not before saying a few words. First of all, a huge thank you to all panelists for taking the time to be with us today and for your excellent presentations. Thank you to all participants for attending and asking questions. Of course, thanks to the Animal Welfare Intergroup and Eurogroup for Animals and my co-host Manuela Ripa. It is vital that the EU-Australia Free Trade Agreements include strong commitments to the protection of farmed animals, as well as domestic wildlife and their habitats. And today we spoke about several animal welfare issues, such as mulesing, the use of battery cages for laying hens, and of course the kangaroo hunting. But a lot of other topics could be addressed here in the EU trade agreement with Australia, such as, for instance, the lack of protection of Australia's shark populations and other marine wildlife. The continued use of shark nets and drum lines, for instance, pose a threat to marine wildlife. And I can continue. There are so many topics, but let's go back to the kangaroos. Our speakers today have described barbaric practice happening in remote Australia. But the European Union plays a major role in this as the biggest importer of these products. The food safety issues mentioned includes sanitary risks that need to be re-evaluated, especially in the light of what current COVID-19 crisis should have taught us. Furthermore, the abuse and exploitation of kangaroos and their babies is, in my view, unacceptable. It is time for the European Union to confirm its leadership in terms of animal welfare and food safety standards. And I think the only way to do that is by introducing an import ban on kangaroo products. The European Commission said, well, we have no intention to do this. I would add the word yet. We cannot let these animals suffer any longer in return for some short-term economic profit. Enough is enough. Thank you all. Have a very good day or very good evening. And I hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.